I was a Star Fox fan. I looked forward to any bit of Star Fox news the same way a starving dog watched a butcher shop. Adventures was more akin to a Zelda game, and Assault had clunky foot missions, and Command had weird control stuff. But I liked them nonetheless. So imagine my joy in 2015 around E3 when Nintendo said they were teaming up with Platinum Games and were well into production on a traditional Star Fox game with new vehicles and the advantages of modern hardware.
I was very excited!
Starting with a quick history, Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, released in '91, was a tech marvel at the time but has not aged well. Star Fox 2 was never released in spite of being 95% complete until the Super Nintendo Classic came out. In '97, Star Fox 64 was released, bringing a new, timeless classic to the world that holds up even to this day. Star Fox 64 was essentially a remake of the first Star Fox with better graphics, animation levels, and full voice acting. And those controls? Seriously, the controls were simple, comprehensive, and intuitive. Everything that it needed to be for the system and the game.
But then Star Fox went through a few awkward years.
In 2002, Rare made a Zelda-esque game, Star Fox Adventures, for the GameCube, but that had very little of the actual Star Fox brand flying and shooting. But I didn't hate it, and it tried something new by continuing the Star Fox narrative beyond the traditional Star Fox and Company saves Galaxy from Andros via rail shooting. Beyond that, the only real outstanding credit this game has for the history of video games is creating one of the furry community's first major sex symbols, Crystal the Fox.
You know him, right? Fight me!
Then in 2005, Star Fox Assault came along and returned with some amazing flying and shooting, but it got a little sloppy when it tried to spice things up with on-foot third-person shooter segments. But I want to focus on something in particular. Imagine the polished gameplay of Star Fox 64 with beautiful graphics and visuals to create a truly cinematic experience like the legendary Star Wars scenes that Miyamoto stated inspired Star Fox 64. That's what the on-rail flying and shooting segments felt like, and I definitely didn't hate it. Me and my friends poured hours into the multiplayer, and my friends instilled a deep fear of the following battle cry.
Bunny, bunny, bunny.
Seriously, Steven, you and that rabbit haunted me for years.
Bunny, bunny, bunny!
Then came Star Fox Command in 2006 on the DS. This one had some very, let's put it diplomatically, interesting ideas for controls and gameplay, but for the most part they worked. Planning strategic movement of ships in specific systems, branching story paths dependent on decisions you made with each mission, and multiple endings. The controls using mostly the touchscreen were a little awkward to get used to, but they were straightforward and worked for the system. Although they could and indeed should have been considered as a warning sign for future trends. Then all remained quiet for quite some time. The franchise skipped a console generation with no new titles for the Wii. This was because of an attitude that Shigeru Miyamoto had. He didn't want to make another game without some manner of innovation for the series. We at least got a Star Fox 64 port on the eShop and a remake for the 3DS in 2011, with the totally imaginative title Star Fox 64 3D, which is technically a remake of Star Fox 64, being a reimagining of the very first game. A remake of a remake. Then things went quiet again for a few years. But finally, in 2015, we got a bone. Nintendo was bringing Star Fox game with the next entry, Star Fox Zero, and I, as a Star Fox fan, was elated. And then it came out, and I think it's time to pull up a relevant quote from Mr. Miyamoto himself. What was that, Mr. Miyamoto? A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad.
Well, then either this game was actually legitimately rushed, or it should have been delayed. I would have taken next to anything over this motion control-induced
Okay, I may be a bit hyperbolic here, but I hope you realize how intense my feelings are on this game now. I was a Star Fox superfan. Was being the operative word. I owned a Star Fox-only collection with some of the best pieces a Star Fox fan could own. I sold that collection and was able to buy a freaking car. I was a Star Fox superfan, and this game ruined that. Let's start with a few reasons why. First, the elephant in the room. The touchscreen mandated controls that work in conjunction with the TV do not work with the biological human eye structure. For the uninitiated, this game uses a control scheme where you pilot your ship with traditional third-person game controls, but to precisely aim, you must take a first-person view from the cockpit and use that to aim with the touchscreen at the same time as flying. This is unwieldy at best, and you know what? It's just plain unwieldy. Now, before anyone brings it up, Star Fox Command isn't seamless, but that control scheme does become natural after a while of implementation, since it only concerns one degree of significant motion that matches through processes regarding the intended path as opposed to two. This is what makes Zero so unintuitive. You see, having to divert your attention in a fast-paced dogfight scenario from the TV screen to the touchscreen at the same time makes it much harder to place a shot or position yourself within a reasonable time frame. If you take your eyes off the touchscreen to get your bearings, then there is a good chance you will lose the shot you were initially intending, and staring too long at the touchscreen will more than likely screw up your positioning for whatever shot you were intending. If our eyes could move independently of each other, like a chameleon, then it may have worked. Now on the R-Wing, this problem isn't usually deal-breaking. After about a 5-hour adjustment period, you can sort of do it instinctively, tilting the touchscreen controller to position your crosshairs. But then that becomes a matter of cumbersome motion controls that the Wii was successful in establishing. Motion controls do very little to add, and in most cases, usually take away from immersion. But as I said, these issues aren't the worst when it comes to the R-Wing.
No, the problem is another attempt at innovation in the infamous form of the chicken walker.
The walker is actually a remnant from the unreleased Star Fox 2, and trust me when I say that Star Fox 2, in spite of its technical limitations and limited control capabilities, did it better. Let that sink in. A game set to be released in 1996 put the controls of a 2016 game to shame. Although I digress, the segments may have been more bearable due to the simple fact they could only have so many enemies or obstacles on screen. But back to the modern implementation. The mech seems like it would be easy enough if you were to just take the control scheme from the average third-person shooter made in this age. Well, for this game, take that as a base, but remove the ability to strafe easily. You must move forward or backward like a bulky 3-point turn, or initiate a dodge roll. And the aiming? That gets locked to that forsaken cockpit view that I mentioned before. If there wasn't a lock-on feature, it would be almost entirely unplayable. Isn't it somewhat established that one stick handling movement and the other handling vision is the proven standard? This control scheme is comparable to trying to play a light gun game, but instead of the movement being handled for you, you have to put down the gun and pick up a controller to move. After a while, I was able to adjust the touchscreen controller instinctively in a certain direction. But not only does it have all these problems, but then they expect you to do platforming in this thing. What's more, the control to jump is to press down on the right control stick. That goes against every control instinct I have, and this comes from a guy that uses Y inversion on most consoles. The chicken mech is by far behind the worst segments of this game, and any fun I was having was brought to a screeching halt. And let me say that making the final boss fight use mostly your mech mode was just the moldy cherry on top for me. Although I will admit accidentally activating chicken mode saved me at least once from getting shot, because even in the reaches of space, where there is no gravity, your mech drops like a rock.
In space, where there is no gravity, and you fall. What the?
Now before I entirely move on, let's go back a few sentences and focus specifically on the final boss fight. Spoiler warning, Fox fights Andross. You're welcome. This incorporates most of the worst design ideas and focuses on them for the gameplay. In Star Fox 64, most of the boss fights have short windows between boss vulnerabilities that keep the action focused and engaging. In Zero's final fight, there are two phases, one of which you are entirely unable to do damage to the boss and must simply dodge while having limited spatial awareness due to the locked camera angle. In the other phase, where you have to use the chicken walker, there's extremely limited time that Andross is vulnerable. The biggest difficulty is due to, of course, the screen aiming system, and that combined with the lack of agency in the flow of the fight makes this entire part of the game an exercise in tedium and frustration. Now this isn't the only boss fight that is like this, but the fact that it's the final boss, which is going to leave the last and potentially strongest impression of the game, means that anyone that does play the game to the end is going to be left with a bad taste in their mouth. Now as for the other new vehicle, they also have an Osprey-like helicopter that they gear more towards stealth and hacking, but these levels come across as more boring than anything. And when you do get a rhythm for flying these sections, it's usually brought to a halt by needing to land so you can have a stupid little mech thing come out and press a button. Couldn't they have just had Slippy make a special projectile that you could hack whatever you shot at rather than this stupid robot? I can imagine some amazing fights that could take place if they just tweaked this stupid ship to move faster and took away its robot. But seriously, who in the hell thought that stealth had any business in the same zip code as a traditional Star Fox title? A series renowned for flying and gunning through epic space battles.
All in all, as a long-term Star Fox fan, I just find myself exhausted at this point. We wait for years and years, and the first shining glimpse of anything great we get is mired by an irrational sense to innovate and fix what is not broken.
And one quick side note about characters before I forget. All the other characters in the game have a bad case of needing to shut the hell up! I know it isn't a new complaint, but it gets turned to 11 in Zero because your allies take every chance they can to remind you to use the awfully implemented control functions. Things you are likely trying to ignore or work around because they are more of a hindrance to the game than anything else. And on a final note, why are we getting another retelling of the same story we've had about 4 or 5 times now? I'll reiterate, Star Fox 64 was a reimagining of Star Fox. Star Fox 64 was ported and remade, and now we have this, that while fleshing out a few more things, is still another retelling of the original Star Fox from the Super Nintendo. It even has almost the same exact ending as Star Fox 64, except the final flying portion is replaced with chicken walkers. I get Nintendo games aren't always known for having complex, interconnected stories from game to game. I mean, look at Mario. How many times has he saved Peach from Bowser at this point? No, seriously, I want to know if someone can tell me in the comments. But Star Fox was something of an exception along with Metroid and Zelda. Yeah, the games usually have some similar tendencies and ended up with you fighting Andross or something, but it was always interesting to see how we got there and what new experiences we could have along the way. With a new Star Fox, they could have been called into a civil war scenario or a continuation of the Aperoid menace. Maybe have it take a turn with Wolf O'Donnell going from professional rival to malicious force in a misguided attempt to outdo Fox. But no, let's retcon at least 3 games out of existence. Let's read the same book again. And speaking of books, there are even manga and comics related to that you can read if you want to dive in further. This is the part that irritates me the most. Previous games established lore and actual character traits. Plus it was more character-driven, particularly Assault and Command. It could have just been me, but it looks like they paid a little bit more attention to the writing behind the characters, their flaws, their arcs. But no, Nintendo decided to throw away all the previously established characters, arcs, worlds, species, and everything else, so they could go back to a poorly done retcon. A retcon that fell flat because they needed to mix up the formula.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, as I've reviewed a game from a series that I love, but quite rightfully deserves to be executed, I feel there's no more poignant a time to introduce you to the new Guillotine, or what I'm nicknaming the Slicer.
No, Nintendo. Sorry, but not sorry when I say this. You lost sight on this project. You seem insistent that innovating is the only thing that matters, but if you cut the fun to do so, then you just shouldn't have done it. New forms of interaction, control schemes, and hardware, these aren't the only means to innovate. Sometimes something can be considered innovative just by polishing the previously established formula to a mirror shine. And if you look at one particular interview with Platinum Games, if you look between the lines of what they're saying, you can tell they knew that the control scheme was not good, but Nintendo needed to go in their blind fury and charge towards the horizon of innovation, even if it means they drove off a cliff to do so. There were glimpses of brilliance in this game. The speed flying segment in particular was exhilarating. Take away the shooting, and the flying was perfectly fine.
Nintendo, let this execution be a message for you. You have earned a lot of goodwill from several people over the years for several franchises that you yourself are responsible for. But you have also earned a lot of ire from these same fan bases that you continue to neglect by focusing on a select few titles and making, frankly, astounding decisions.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. Reviewing this game and making the new Guillotine are 2 things that I've wanted to do for quite some time. I find it interesting that the things that usually get you most impassioned are the things that you have negative associations with. Anyway, someone let me know if there's something you'd like to see go on the chopping block. So until next time, thanks for watching, and God bless all of you.